What if we told you that many of the economic differences we see between people around the world, past, present, and future, can be simply explained by differences in just how old those people are? That rich countries are rich because they're mostly nations of adults, and that poor countries are poor because they're nations of mostly teenagers and children. Sounds a bit crazy, right? Oversimplified, you might even say. Well, stay tuned, because this is the story of how demography changed the world. Welcome to the Brains versus Stomachs Project. On this channel, we talk about demography and economics. In this video, we make the case for our channel's core thesis, that demographic factors have indeed played a very crucial role in economic differences. Demography is most certainly not destiny, but it is a powerful economic force of nature, and here's why. On the horizontal axis, that's median age. It's the average age of the population. More specifically, that's the age that splits the population in two equal halves. The higher the number, then generally the more adults as a share of the total population. On the vertical axis is GDP per capita, an imperfect but still useful measure of economic development. It's also adjusted for differences in cost of living. Every point here represents a country, and the chart covers over 180 of them. You can see for yourself what's happening here. For up to 75 years now, as countries get older, they all get richer, regardless of their geography, identity, political, or economic system. When nations are young, that is a median age from around 15 to the mid-20s, they're mostly poor. And as they get older, median age of 35 and beyond, they mostly become middle to high income countries. Okay, so what exactly is going on here? This is what's called the demographic transition. This is a social transformation that leads to societies getting older in terms of their age structure. That is, populations transition from being mostly made up of teenagers and children to being made up of mostly adults. Our argument is that this demographic transition also works as an economic transition. But to understand what the demographic transition is, we first need to talk about population pyramids. This is a population pyramid. It shows the population size of each age group. On the left are men, and on the right are women. On the vertical axis is the age group. For much of human history, population pyramids looked just like this. Lots of children at the bottom, very few adults in the middle, and even fewer elderly people at the top. This was all because of high death rates, more specifically high infant mortality. You see, prior to the discovery of germ theory and the advent of modern medicine in the 19th century, the majority of people never made it past their 5th birthday. Life was brutal, and this was especially bad for women because it was mostly women that shouldered the cost of raising additional children, not to mention the higher mortality that women themselves suffered due to having so many live births. Patriarchal norms also made the situation worse. Women have historically been excluded from the formal economy and relegated to doing unpaid but essential work such as maintaining the household and rearing all those children. All these factors combined led to near guaranteed economic poverty. This is illustrated in the following population pyramid, where green represents adults in specialized work. These are typically workers who could specialize in specific roles such as blacksmithing, tax collection, and trade. Red represents adults not engaged in specialized production, such as subsistence farmers and child rearing. Gray represents non-adults, basically children, teenagers, and the elderly. The pie chart on the right illustrates just how dependent societies were on a few specialized workers to keep the economy going. As you can see, meaningful economic production was left to a few men and even fewer women. The result? A population of primarily young people consuming most of what they produce and barely surviving. A fundamental principle in economic growth theory is that a society needs to produce more than it consumes in order to save the surplus for growth. And with no surplus, there's almost no growth. But then, starting in the 18th century in Europe, the demographic transition kicked in and we started getting older. This demographic transition is triggered by two things: falling death rates and then falling birth rates. First, death rates declined through healthcare advancements such as vaccines, antibiotics, and hygiene standards. Societies went from most people dying before their 5th birthday to most people dying from old age. Secondly, birth rates declined through a range of policies targeting women's emancipation and lower infant mortality. Empowering women also means reducing patriarchal workplace barriers and equalizing educational and occupational opportunities. The labor force then expands thanks to more female workers. Let's get back to our colorful population pyramid here. This is what a demographic transition does. You can see it here how the green area, the net producers, increases as a share of the total population after a demographic transition. You go from having a society of mostly young dependents to a society of mostly adult net producers. This economically supercharges your economy. It's a guaranteed growth stimulus. Here's why. It starts with basic human biology. Adults are naturally more productive than children and teenagers. They're smarter, bigger, stronger, faster, more agile, more experienced, more emotionally mature. The list goes on. The more adults per capita over long periods of time, the more productive the society. Economically, it means a population of adults will produce more goods and services at any given time than a population of youth and elderly. All other things being equal, of course. And the more inclusive your society, the more workers you can get from your adult population. By inclusive in this context, we simply mean extending employment rights and opportunities to as many of those adults as possible. Especially women, who have historically been marginalized from the more formal economy. But there's more. The more of these workers, the more productive they become. That's because some workers can then specialize in expanding worker productivity by providing services such as education, building better equipment, and developing new technologies. It's not rocket science. A population of adults will outproduce and outgrow a population of kids, just like all the science and the data tells us. Unfortunately, not all the economics literature has caught up to this fact. Indeed, among many academics specifically, the widespread belief is that adult populations are not automatically more productive than youthful ones. Hey guys, time for a quick commercial break, because this is where our research project comes in. You see, our mission is to tell you about this less popular but far more empirically accurate theory, that demography does indeed have a guaranteed effect on the economy. This isn't new, but it is a rather niche argument, and that's why doing this kind of research and getting a platform for it is not easy, and why videos like this take hours of study and analysis by a whole team of people. And we can't do it alone, so please, if you like what you've been watching and listening to so far, leave us a like and subscribe. And if you want to see our work continue, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Okay, let's get back to the video. So now that we know how demography affects the economy, let's take a closer look at the evidence to support this thesis. We'll do this by taking a look at the demographic history of Europe and Africa as case studies, arguably the respective richest and poorest continents the past few centuries. Let's start with Europe. Being much further away from the equator was the first demographic advantage Europe had. That's because the further one is from the equator, the lower the burden of disease, and hence the older that population becomes, to an extent, of course. One might think the frosty climate of Europe posed a major barrier to human development, but not really. Cold weather certainly imposes hard limits in terms of food availability and permanent settlement, but the cold simply isn't as deadly as germs, which are far more heavily concentrated along the tropics. So even before the advent of modern medicine, a human born in Europe had a noticeably higher probability of surviving through adulthood than one born in tropical Asia or Africa. In other words, Europe was easier, and humans could simply better survive and thrive there. That's partly why by 10,000 BC, Europe had a much larger estimated population than even Africa, even though modern humans originated from Africa. The good times didn't end there for Europeans, because around the 18th century, Europe ushered in the modern demographic transition. By the 19th century, European fertility rates were also declining and women started entering formal labor. And so, by the 1960s, in our favorite chart here, Europe was much older than other regions. More specifically, Europe had been much older than everyone else for up to 2 centuries. This all greatly explains why by the 1960s, Europe was also much wealthier than other nations. Of course, demography isn't the only factor behind Europe's recent success. In the case of Western Europe specifically, a significant share of wealth was generated through conquest and empire. However, it would be inaccurate to say that all of Europe's current wealth was built through imperialism. As mentioned, Europe has, for a long time, effectively been blessed with a population of mostly young adults, while everyone else in Asia, Africa, and beyond had a population of mostly teenagers and children. And as you can see in this chart here, since the 1960s, Europe has continued being older than the rest of the world, as fertility and mortality rates have continued declining. To a lesser extent, inward migration has also helped. That further explains why the region remains more prosperous than others today. But now, Europe is experiencing a combination of unprecedented demographic forces: low fertility, declining population, and aging. Some see this as a great cause for concern, an existential crisis even. In reality, European prosperity will likely continue. Take the case of Central Europe and the Baltics, for example. These are the nations of Bulgaria, Croatia, Czechia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Since 1990, this region of Europe has consistently had subreplacement fertility and very little in the way of inward migration. The result? A loss of almost 10% of its entire population. And yet, despite this apparent population collapse, GDP per capita has skyrocketed from around $7,500 per capita to around $50,000 per capita. That's an increase of almost 6 times. Not bad for a region supposedly facing demographic extinction. This represents an important quirk about demography and economic development. When nations are very young, poverty and economic sluggishness is pretty much guaranteed. But when nations get very old, as is the trajectory of Europe and many other countries outside Africa, they don't all necessarily stop growing and become poor. While the growing share of elderly people will put a strain on public spending and growth, an aging Europa can still unlock other sources of growth. AI, automation, and gene editing are just some of the exciting technologies that will allow Europe to stay rich and prosperous. It's also important to note that the elderly contribute to society in valuable ways that GDP doesn't capture, such as community work, charity, and looking after the young. And even though Europe's population and economy may decline as a share of the world's total, the region's first mover advantages will likely remain. Europe and its Western offshoots have been responsible for many of the discoveries and technologies that much of the world relies on today. Because of this, European art, culture, language, and social norms will likely continue having an outsized presence in human society for many more years. Overall, demography has been good to Europe. Having an older and at times bigger population has greatly propelled the region's economy, and even with an aging and declining population, Europe's future remains prosperous. Now let's look at Africa. As mentioned earlier, disease is what has historically kept populations young. And sadly, Africa is an ecological treasure for not just creatures, but also deadly microbes that cause diseases. You see, Africa is the most biodiverse continent on planet Earth, and with a diversity of birds, fish, reptiles, mammals, and the like, you also get a diversity of disease-causing bacteria, viruses, and parasites. These are also known as pathogens, and they are not evenly distributed across the globe. Most of the world's pathogens are concentrated along the equator. More importantly, the world's deadliest pathogens to humans happen to be located in Africa. This technically makes Africa the deadliest habitable continent known to mankind. This higher mortal risk is what's kept the inhabitants of Africa much younger than other people across the globe. It's also made population growth much slower throughout ancient times. But more importantly, it's what has made economic development in Africa that much more difficult. But that still didn't stop Africa from developing civilizations that were equal to, and in some instances more advanced than leading civilizations in Asia and Europe. African civilizations such as the Carthaginian Empire and the Empire of Benin, for example. But even when Africa did excel, disease burden played a very significant role. Africa's most powerful and advanced ancient civilizations, such as ancient Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush, the Songhai Empire, and the Aksumite Empire, all developed in the northern and western parts of Africa. These regions, with their more Mediterranean and Sahelian climates, had a lower burden of disease than the more tropical regions of Central and Interior Africa. A similar trend emerges among the Bantu peoples of Southern Africa. The region's most well-developed civilizations, such as the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Mapungubwe, and the Zulu Kingdom, all emerged south of the malaria belt. The malaria belt simply refers to the boundary within which malaria-spreading mosquitoes are more prevalent all year round. And being the deadliest parasite known to mankind, malaria's effect on mortality and age is quite pronounced. The more malaria, the younger the population, and the harder economic development becomes. That's why, as you can see in this chart, the effect persists even today. Countries below the malaria belt, such as South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, are still noticeably older and richer than their neighbors within the malaria belt, such as Angola, Malawi, and Zambia. But it's not just disease that's plagued Africa. Centuries of brutal imperialism, subjugation, and extraction have also taken their toll on the continent. And in many ways, this has greatly worsened these underlying problems. In summary, economic development in Africa has been harder because Africa has been harder. You can see it for yourself in this chart you saw earlier. Since the 60s, every other major region has gotten older and richer. Europe was already older, and Asia got older very quickly, and now they're both rich and still getting richer. Africa, however, has stayed young, and sadly, that's why she stayed poor. But that's where Africa's bad news ends, because the region's demographics are finally improving. You see, a quiet demographic miracle is rapidly unfolding across the continent, a miracle that isn't captured by GDP numbers, and one you don't hear much about in the media. Africa is finally getting older. Mortality rates in Africa are now at historic lows, life expectancy at all-time highs, and still rapidly improving. Moreover, fertility rates in Africa have been steadily declining since the late 70s. And even though getting accurate fertility data across the continent can be challenging, recent studies suggest Africa's fertility rates are collapsing much faster than UN projections. As Africa gets older, with certainty, the continent will finally get richer. In fact, it's already happening, as you can see in this chart. It's no surprise that some of Africa's oldest countries, such as Mauritius, Seychelles, South Africa, and Tunisia, as highlighted here, are also some of Africa's richest nations. You might be inclined to recite the usual academic response that nothing is guaranteed because they might fail to harness the dividend in the window of opportunity or whatever. Well, as you can see here in our favorite chart, there's no evidence for this alarmist forecast whatsoever. Every nation that's become older has also become richer. And every nation that was as young as Africa was also just as poor as Africa at that age. When Europe, Asia, and South America were in the same high fertility and high mortality regime as Africa, they were all just as poor and just as sluggish in their growth as Africa. They all got older, and then they all got richer. Africa is no exception. The truth is, Africa's future is amazing. The continent is not just set to get older and richer, Africa's relative population is also set to explode. Based on current projections, the continent could account for over a third of all humanity by the end of this century. More importantly, Africa could have around 40% of the world's working age population and almost half its births by that time, transforming the currently poverty-ridden continent into a true geopolitical juggernaut. In summary, demography has been harsh to Africa, but all that is now changing. The people of Africa have so much to look forward to towards the middle of the century and beyond. Hey there, time for another quick commercial break. In this video, we've focused mostly on just two major regions, but we've got a lot of exciting content up ahead for Asia and North America. We're especially excited about Asia and the Rise of China series that we're currently working on, so that's up next, because the Chinese century is truly upon us, and Asia in general has a very exciting future up ahead that will likely emerge as an economic and political capital of our species, so very excited for Asia. North America's demography is another exciting story we'll be working on later, because that's a region that could very well stay on top in terms of, per capita prosperity and all that good stuff, because given, America's already got a very good and impressive head start. So if you'd like to see more of that content, please consider supporting our channel. Check out the links in the video description below for more. And if you'd like to know more about the project and the people behind it, please also check out our Patreon page. More importantly, we'd love to hear from you, so please leave a comment below. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and smack that bell notification. So there you have it. Many of the economic differences we see between people past, present, and future really can be explained by demographic forces. And the forces of demography aren't done with us yet. You see, humanity is still getting older. And through continued advancements in technology and automation, we're still generating more economic productivity and prosperity. And contrary to a lot of the scaremongering you'll get in your newsfeed about population aging and the supposed fertility crisis, it's going to be okay. Sure, population aging and decline does slow down economic growth by a bit, but it's not an economic extinction event. And remember, such population scaremongering is nothing new. Last century, for example, many claimed expanding populations would usher in a world of mass famines and civilizational ruin. That never happened. Today, we see similar threats about collapsing fertility and population. But like we showed you earlier with the example of Central Europe, and given the fact that technology tends to evolve faster than glacial demographic forces, this population fear-mongering is greatly exaggerated and not helpful. When it comes to population, alarmist projections always sell better for the media. The actual outcomes, however, tend to be far less severe. And given the strain humanity's recent population surge has placed on our ecological resources, declining population may just be what Mother Nature ordered to bring back some balance. The truth is, thanks to this demographic transition, we as a species are experiencing unprecedented levels of prosperity. It's a truly wonderful time to be alive. Never in the history of humanity have we ever been this long-lived and this prosperous. That is not a coincidence. We say, long may these demographic trends continue. Humanity's future is looking brighter than ever before, because that is how demography changed the world.